Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us this evening. This is our first Circle Night in person in 3 years, and it's great to see everybody. It's good to be back. Thank you for braving the weather that's going to be later, so on your way. I also want to welcome our Zoom guests who are joining us from New York City, Washington, D.C., and Wisconsin. Hi, Gloria. It's good to see you, sort of. I can't quite see you. And of course, across the Bay Area. So different GSE events have different characteristics that you can sort of feel in the air. I don't, I go to a lot of these. And so one is the Alumni and Excellence Award. This one is about warmth and pride for others. You're in a room and everybody is proud of everybody in the room. It's really a special event. Um, graduation. Graduation always has the same feel. It's one of great relief and possibility. You feel it in the students, in the families. So Circle Night, it's about generosity and gratitude. So it's about the generosity of donors who've chosen to support our students and the school and the faculty. Uh, so the donors want to support the educational mission, but I also see a very special, big-hearted generosity in giving to individuals who have committed themselves to improving education. Some of you, and I won't name names, have supported the GSE for more than 45 years. I know, that's 45 years. You set out a very high bar for what it means to be a good teammate. And I know that this kind of dedication and generosity must be deeply fulfilling. To give money, for example, to students who you haven't met. This is a very generous and fulfilling moment. As for gratitude, tonight is also a chance for the recipients of these gifts to express their thanks, which I also find incredibly uplifting. Feeling heartfelt gratitude and recognizing selfless generosity, it elevates the spirit. Personally, when someone does something nice for me, being able to say thank you is just this burst of sweet emotion that makes the gift even better. Tonight, there's also a second type of generosity. It's the generosity of people who've chosen to dedicate their lives to the betterment of individuals in society by committing to education. There are very, very many talented people in this room, all of whom could have great personal success in however they choose to apply their talents and their benefits. Fortunately for us, you've committed to helping other people through education. For that, you have the gratitude of everyone in this room. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening so you can directly experience the feelings of generosity and gratitude. So as I mentioned, many of our philanthropic friends have been with the GSE for a long time. They witnessed the transition from the Stanford University School of Education to the Graduate School of Education. They have seen, there have been many other changes. For example, back in the day, Susie was known for its superior programs in physical education. We delivered the best. I sort of would like to bring it back. And there are a lot of changes afoot at the GSE right now. It's a time for inflection in education and in a lot of ways. It's an inflection in who has access to a GSE education, thanks to you, and for what's happening at the GSE. So we're building a university-wide initiative called the Stanford Accelerator for Learning to help us bring educational solutions from the great research universities to the world more effectively. Another change, for those of you who went to the Susie, you may fondly remember the dank and dark basement of the education building. Yeah, I'm sorry, but they're just going to have to be memories from now on. So we're getting a new campus. The buildings will be glorious. And when you see them, you'll have to admit, life may be better without that basement. The new campus will make it much easier to do the kind of work in collaboration that have become the hallmarks of modern educational research and teaching. And I'm deeply thankful for the trust and importance that Stanford and our philanthropic community has given to the School for Education. More concretely, we are having the groundbreaking ceremony for the new campus soon. I believe there is going to be a 5x5 box with dirt in it, and we put a shovel and turn it over. I don't know the emotional characteristics of the event, but I have a guess. Optimistic incredulity. It has been quite a long road to get a new campus. So I hope you all get a chance to enjoy that. I look forward to giving people tours, and you'll see. It's going to be a place where people can convene and not hide in stairwells. So next, I have the fabulous privilege of introducing this year's honorary chairperson, Lori Barnett Triger. So Lori is a retired television executive who now serves as co-chair of the Barnett Foundation. The Barnett Foundation is involved with various educational and medical nonprofits, including the Barnett Center for the Integrated Arts and Enterprise at The Ohio State University and ALS. I know her as a trusted and incredibly thoughtful member of the GSE's Advisory Council. There was one meeting where I was about to see a very important group in Los Angeles, and I was telling Lori what I had in mind. She basically looked at me and said, no, say what you think. It was very good advice. And I thought better because it wasn't. So she's one of GSE's most dedicated advocates. She's serving on our advisory council. I also know that she will be too modest to share that she's the proud mother of Jackson, a member of the Stanford class of 2025, who may be in basketball games this evening. So Lori and her brothers, Jim and Larry, established the Barnett Family Professorship, which Professor Tom D now holds. They recognize that education policy and decision-making at our schools and kids need to thrive should be informed by science and data. And this is how I best know Lori and her family. They're people who care so much about learning that they're unwilling to leave it to chance. So thank you again to the Barnett family, and thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Dan. I can't tell you how gratifying it's been to work with you and to witness the truly extraordinary way you have raised the profile of the Graduate School of Education across the university and beyond. Quite frankly, it's absolutely stunning to think about the growth of the school since you became dean. So thank you. Tonight, I'm honored to welcome all of you, both those here on campus and those joining remotely, to the Graduate School of Education's annual Circle Night. This event is an opportunity to say thank you for believing in the power of education to improve all lives through learning, and for making the critical decision to support the GSE and education more broadly. Thank you for joining us. As a Stanford alumna, I'm grateful to the university. My time here inspired a deep respect for learning and education. It is certainly my great hope that my son, currently a sophomore on campus, as Dan said, will leave the farm with a similar appreciation for knowledge and lifelong learning. My own experience at Stanford led me to see the world through a special lens, one that was infused with the light of curiosity, open-mindedness, and tolerance. Now, as a member of the Stanford GSE Advisory Council, I have a window into the many important decisions and issues that Dan and his faculty wrestle with every day. I've seen the GSE's impact on campus, schools, and districts across the country and around the world. For example, the GSE helps students, educators, policymakers, institutions, and parents gain access to unprecedented research and programs. The GSE currently has the opportunity to transform learning, and its goal of improving lives is at the core of everything that happens within the school. I think it's safe to say that all of us are here tonight because we believe in the school's vision of a world where all learners are prepared to thrive in a dynamic future, and that universities like Stanford have a special responsibility to pre-K through 12 education. My siblings and I were brought up to value education. In fact, my family believes that if you want to influence and change the world, education is a highly leveraged investment. Policy in particular can be highly leveraged, although it may be difficult to measure its impact in the short term. Nonetheless, areas such as policy, data, and research are of great import, which now brings me to tonight's speakers. On behalf of my family, I'm most proud to introduce Tom D., the Barnett Family Professor of Education. Like his predecessor, Susanna Loeb, Tom brings a deep and nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities that exist when we turn to data and science to inform education policy. Recently, Tom has been collaborating with the Associated Press and has new insights on pandemic enrollment loss, which we are fortunate to hear about tonight. Tom's core teaching responsibility centers on a large doctoral level class on research tools used to inform the causal effects of programs and policies in education. At the end of this class, some of his graduate students nominated Tom for the school's most prestigious teaching award. That's high praise, Tom. The impact of Tom's scholarship has been both broad and deep. I don't want to steal Tom and Liz's thunder, but I was personally inspired by their work on learning loss when it first appeared on the front page of the Sunday New York Times. Next, I have the honor of introducing Tom's co-presenter, GSE doctoral candidate Elizabeth Huffaker. Liz applied to the GSE in search of an opportunity to study with Tom. Although they didn't meet until PhD admit day, they had shared roots as part of the same academic family. Liz's mentor at Teachers College at Columbia had been a mentee of Tom's. Liz has a BA in economics, but became a teacher after graduating because she was not particularly interested in the fields covered by her undergraduate economics sequence. She came back to the economics of education after recognizing how the discipline's theories and tools could help answer questions that percolated during her time in the classroom. Thank you, Liz. We know that education plays a central role in every dimension of how economists conceptualize social welfare. Tom shared recently that there are great intellectual and practical possibilities in combining the tools that have been developed and refined by economists in recent years with the data and questions that exist in education. The Stanford GSE has been in the vanguard of realizing those possibilities and training new generations of researchers along those lines. And now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Tom and Liz.
Thank you so much for coming, folks. And before I begin, I just would like to stress, add my own note of appreciation. I've spent, I guess, less than half of my career at Stanford, so I've gotten to experience keenly what your generosity has built in terms of a first-class university. And a big part of that is our capacity to attract the next generation of leading scholars and support them. And Liz is definitely a leading example of that. And also, the fact that we're surrounded by such great staff support, including the staff who've put together this evening. But I think that generosity also builds something else that is unique to Stanford. It's this idea of a culture of asking ambitious questions and being unafraid to be public facing with that scholarship rather than just inward looking to the academy. And sometimes that keeps you up at night when you're a professor trying to meet the standard that you people have set with your generosity, but it's also very exciting, and I think has just really enlivened my career so much. And I hope what we're talking about tonight will be seen as a modest example of that kind of ambition and that kind of public-facing scholarship. So in particular, I'm going to talk to you about, along with Liz, understanding the pandemic exodus from public schools. So I want to set the stage by underscoring how we're on the cusp of a sober anniversary. We're just 2 days from the time 3 years ago when the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, noting with unfortunate prescience that this is not just a public health crisis, it's a crisis that will touch every sector. And clearly it has. So in beginning to discuss these issues, I want to set two broad questions for this evening, and then situate some of how we've been trying to contribute to this. The two broad questions are, first, what do we know about the impact of the pandemic on students' learning opportunities and their development? And two, how might we assess our ongoing academic recovery efforts? students? Are they adequately meeting that challenge? And within this space, we felt there's a really compelling opportunity to speak to these issues with leading insights based on the early collection and analysis, specifically of enrollment data, okay? But to situate this, I wanna talk a little bit about the broader effects of the pandemic. And I wanna lead with what we're beginning to understand about a youth mental health crisis. And part of the reason I wanna lead with this is it's more common to lead with the academic effects on achievement scores and things of that sort. And sometimes people will push back at that, saying, oh, worrying about so-called learning loss is failing to recognize the resiliency and the adaptability our kids have demonstrated through a crisis. And that's undoubtedly true. We should always keep our kids' assets in the foreground of our mind. However, we shouldn't let that blind us to the trauma that has occurred for children during the pandemic. And to underscore how others have seen this seriously, several pediatric health organizations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, recently declared a national emergency in youth mental health. And the US Surgeon General undertook the very rare step of issuing a public health advisory on this topic. And this has clearly been exacerbated by the pandemic, but it's also part of a burgeoning conversation I'm seeing about what has transpired in US society over the last decade, in particular with the rise of social media and how that has changed the experience of young adults. With that being said, though, clearly there's a role for the pandemic. So, for example, the CDC reports that ER visits by teen girls for suspected suicide attempts grew over 50% during the pandemic period. Really startling and disturbing. And 70% of public schools are reporting an increase in students seeking mental health services. But even looking at sort of more basic social emotional measures, we're seeing emerging evidence right up to the current moment of growing chronic absenteeism among enrolled students. And that's really the leading measure in state accountability systems for capturing what's going on socially and emotionally with students. Can they just engage fundamentally in participating in the academic enterprise? And as we're thinking about this trauma, we shouldn't forget teachers as well. I mean, teachers are reporting extraordinarily high levels of stress, 2 times pre-pandemic levels. Interestingly, researchers like me, my peers, we've been tracking teacher turnover data to see if this would cause a flight from the profession. And in the first 2 years, we haven't seen it. But now we're just seeing emerging data, literally within the last week or two, from several states suggesting a sharp uptick in teacher flight from the profession in the current school year. So that's something to watch and to follow up on. So that's one important context for what the pandemic has wrought and the challenge it has set for us. The other, and perhaps one better known to us, are the setbacks in learning. And really, it is a troubling portrait with serious implications for well-being, for economic growth, for equality. And the most clean data on this come from the federal test scores released last year. Some early test score data from formative assessments pointed in this direction, but those were taken virtually, often in different formats. But these federal data really captured attention because this is the nation's report card. And it's capturing kids across public and private schools. And we saw historic declines in reading and math achievement, erasing nearly 20 years of hard-won gains in the math learning of 4th grade and 8th grade students. Really quite disturbing. And digging further, we saw these kind of K-shaped trajectories where there were bigger losses among low-income students and among minoritized students. I do want to insert a note of caution, though, for when you see people discussing these test score data in your own community, because I've seen that here in the Bay Area, in Palo Alto. Some of the state and local comparisons can be really vexed by what I'm going to show you, Liz and I are going to show you, is going on with enrollment. I've seen some superintendents doing what look like end zone dances over the fact that their test scores seem to rise during the pandemic. But if you look more closely, what you could see is a flight of some of their most vulnerable students from the district. And it's disappointing to see some education leaders not grappling more coherently with what those data should be telling them. And I would also point out, and this is going to be a theme I stress towards the end of the talk, paying heed to what we don't know. we focus on tested grades, which are typically 3 to 8. We know comparatively little about what's going on with achievement in early elementary grades or at the high school level. So within this context, we saw an opportunity to look to public enrollment data as a crude but important leading indicator. And part of what makes it compelling is it's available relatively quickly. It's available fairly universally, measured with a pretty high degree of accuracy. And it's going to tell us something about the learning environments and experiences of students before we might see them realized in other outcome data. It's sort of a canary in a coal mine in some sense. And in particular, shifts in the enrollment data give us insights into whether students might be experiencing reactive switches, school moves. There's a pretty substantial literature that documents that when families have to undertake school switches unexpectedly, it has pejorative effects on child development. Enrollment changes also could point to truancy and dropping out of school, skipping or delaying developmentally critical early learning experience at the kindergarten level in states where that's allowed. And also we're coming to realize, and I'm going to say more about this enrollment change is creating a long-term fiscal threat. I wouldn't even say it's long-term anymore, frankly, because it's coming sooner than any of us might like, to school districts that have lost students. So what are the major patterns in public school enrollment and disenrollment? Well, this is where we took up a partnership, Liz and I, working with a number of journalists at the New York Times and elsewhere, and a unit that exists right here at Stanford called Big Local News. It's a data journalism unit that sits within the Department of Communications here at Stanford. And Dan, as a dog lover, would appreciate how this was incubated, because the head of Big Local News is Cheryl Phillips. And it turns out she lives in my neighborhood. And I met her at our local dog run. And we were sitting there as our dogs played with each other and started talking about our shared interests. And that was the genesis of our involvement in this project. And we went, and I'm going to turn this over to Liz at this point, but we went and ran ahead of the federal government to collect the enrollment data. And another theme I'm going to return to is the lamentable state of our data systems in a crisis that necessitated us doing this. But let me turn it over to Liz, who did so much careful work on collecting and understanding these data and the further research we did on them.
Hi, everyone. Also would like to share my thanks for all of you coming and either braving the rain or joining us on Zoom. And thank you in general for your support of the GSE. And I'm excited to talk a bit more about this project that was really kind of took the sort of big midsection of my time here at Stanford. So yeah, I had the opportunity with Tom after this dog run incident to work with a team that included RAs who were everyone from undergraduates to faculty with Tom and to other affiliates at Stanford. So it was really a cross Stanford project to pull together these, frankly, really messy data from a bunch of different states, well ahead of, almost a year ahead of when the federal government was able to do so. And our top line finding, which actually when we cited the statistic down here, that in fall 2020 compared with fall 2019, at the K-12 level, public schools lost 1.1 million students, that 2.2% decline. An early reviewer of our paper asked us where the citation was for that. And we were like, oh, it's us. We were the first ones to collect the data. We're the citations. So that this was really information that was uncovered by the Stanford team. So I'm going to just first walk us through what that 2.2% decline looks like a little further. All right, so this is a graph of year-to-year change in total public school enrollment from 2006 through fall 2019, so the year before the pandemic. And in general, it's a pretty stable trend. We see approximately a 0.5% growth in total public school enrollment from year to year, not particularly oscillating too much in either direction. This is what the percent change looked like in fall 2020. That's the loss of 1.1 million students. And if we fast forward to fall 2021, we are still seeing a negative year-to-year change, which means that these students have not returned. This is still an even larger loss now than there were compared to fall 2019. So I'm going to talk to you about a study that's really breaking down what were some potential policy drivers of this 1.1 million student loss. And then Tom's going to come back and discuss a little more about what we maybe know about where all of these students ended up. So let's break down that 2.2% decline a little bit further. So you saw how dramatic that drop was. The drop was 9% in kindergarten. So even larger, even like substantially larger than the 2.2% drop. There are some states where kindergarten isn't mandatory, but we still see a substantial decline, a 3% and 4% drop in early grades that certainly are mandatory, like first grade, second grade, third grade. So we really saw this loss of our youngest students from the public schools. We also saw that the reductions in kindergarten enrollment were larger in poorer and urban communities. And we noticed that it was also much larger in districts that in fall 2020, so coming back into the first full year of schooling during the pandemic, that enrollment loss was larger in districts that offered remote-only instruction. So this is the observation that led to our main research question of the study, which was, did choosing that remote-only instruction as opposed to offering instruction in person in fall 2020 actually contribute to this disenrollment? Was it a causal relationship? Debate over this policy decision of whether or not schools should be in person or remote or hybrid have obviously continued. So let's think back a little bit to what the context was in fall 2020. Most students were going to be starting that school year in a remote-only context. In fact, 57% of them. Only 24% of students started that fall 2020, that 2020-2021 academic year in person. This was a time when there was not a vaccine available. I think everyone from practitioners, districts, parents at the state level knew that there were some potentially really challenging trade-offs that we were going to be balancing in terms of both public health and educational and social outcomes for students, but we really didn't have full information, and these were really challenging choices that were being made. So while the debate has continued to rage about the wisdom of school closures, what we think is really important is to understand the best we can using the available data, what the effect of closures were on students in schools. And this begins with looking at the effect on enrollment. This doesn't mean that the public health potential consequences of schooling mode are important, but we're not epidemiologists, so we're not going to do epidemiology. We're going to look at educational outcomes. And the end result of this research question and this partnership was a study providing quasi-experimental evidence of the impact of school closures on district enrollment. Quasi-experimental study designs are those that let us access valid causal effects by looking at data and programs that sort of arise naturally in the education sector or naturally in the world, rather than are designed by a researcher sort of ahead of time. And I think, as was mentioned, Tom and I, ITA, and Tom teaches a class in quasi-experimental methods and have for the last 3 years. And there's actually some people in here who are in that class. So thanks for joining rather than working on your problem sets right now. I'm looking forward to those next Thursday, I think. So it's our last assignment for the quarter. So anyways, eventually this resulted in a study that is forthcoming. So just to give you an idea of those academic publishing timelines, we started this in spring 2021, and we got it accepted to the American Educational Research Journal, and it should be at some point available in print in 2023. I'll be looking forward to that. And before I kind of get you to, just gonna keep suspense a moment longer on what our final results were. But I wanted to just take a second to reflect on what working on this project and the journey from this data project to this forthcoming paper has meant for my progress as a student and for my training at the GSE. So back in spring 2021, I was towards the end of my second year. One thing that I love that the GSE does with its doc students is, instead of having us take a bunch of written exams at the end of our second year, we're supposed to, along with our advisor in the sort of apprenticeship model relationship we have, create a research paper that is like publication worthy, a high caliber paper. We're jumping in and we're doing that sort of really high quality, rigorous research right away. But in spring 2021, I was feeling honestly like pretty unmoored from a lot of the ideas that I thought I'd be looking into, the data I thought I'd be using, the policies I thought I'd be studying because of the pandemic. Either it didn't feel relevant, or honestly, like some of the programs I thought I'd study just were no longer happening. So this was a really timely and relevant project for me, partly because it was a timely and relevant project for children and families and policymakers. I came here to study education policy because I care about creating high quality evidence that is like public facing about education issues that are affecting people in real time. Additionally, I loved the collaborative and outward facing nature of this project, the sort of relationships, both internally and externally, that were necessary in order to undertake this work would really only be possible at an institution like the GSE and working with an advisor like Tom. I will say, and this is where we get to brag a little bit about this study, it set really unrealistic expectations for media coverage. When we did get that New York Times front page, Tom was, and this was my very first public working paper ever, he was like, please do not expect this for all of your future working papers. This is a one-time thing. But what was cool is that in addition to that initial media coverage, there's actually some real staying power, I think, to this paper because people did find it so relevant to contemporary issues. It was named the top education study of 2021 by the Fordham Institute, and some of our work was also featured in 16 charts that changed the way we looked at America's schools in 2021 in the 74. So that was pretty cool. And sort of most critically, it was also an opportunity for me to really use the sophisticated leading quantitative methods that I came to the GSE to learn about and to work on with Tom. And if you are curious to dive into those, I encourage you to look at our paper. There are more equations and tables and figures and robustness checks than you could sort of ever hope to enjoy. But what's cool about this project is that there's actually a pretty intuitive setup to how we were able to get to what is that causal effect of remote-only instruction on enrollment choices. And so I'm going to walk you through a figure that sort of graphically breaks down what we end up observing. All right, so what is going to be graphed over here is so we're going to have 3 different lines. One is tracking the enrollment from fall 2015 through fall 2020 of the districts that in fall 2020 selected remote-only instruction compared to those who selected in-person instruction. And then we have this somewhat more amorphous group that had some type of hybrid instruction. And we're going to be scaling this number by 2015 enrollment. So essentially, if the lines go up, that means that we're seeing an increasing, so a positive enrollment trend. If the lines go down, these are districts that are on average seeing disenrollment even before the pandemic. All right, so let's just fast forward a few years. So fall 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. And so there's an important pattern that we have to account for when we're looking at the effect of instructional mode on the pandemic, which is that these districts were not on the same trajectory prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. The districts that offered remote-only instruction in 2020 are actually slightly decreasing enrollment districts even before the pandemic, whereas the districts that ultimately offered instruction in person were somewhat increasing in enrollment. And if you kind of dig into our data, it's related to things like rural versus urban districts. You can probably think of maybe a few other explanations there. And again, here is that unprecedented decline in enrollment that we observed for our sample districts in fall 2020. And it is different for the remote only versus the in-person districts. For the in-person districts, they still lost a lot of students. Offering instruction in person did not mean that there were just no enrollment loss. We see about a 2 percentage point enrollment loss, but it's versus a 3.3 percentage point enrollment loss for districts that went remote only. However, that simple difference there of 1.3 percentage points is not the full story. We need to account for that pre-existing trend of we're expecting these districts to move apart in terms of enrollment by about 0.5 percentage points per year. So if we put together that gap that emerges during COVID minus the expected divergence in the enrollment trends, we get our main effect size of negative 0.8 percentage points, which essentially means that remote-only instruction did cause a 42% increase in fall 2020 disenrollment, which is about a 1 percentage point decline or equivalent to the additional loss of about 300,000 students from K-12 public schools. And critically, this negative effect is particularly large for kindergarten and to a lesser extent, other elementary school grades. We don't find consistent evidence of effects on middle or high school students, however. So this indicates to us there might be something particular about the revealed preferences of parents of younger students. And I think anyone who's thought about or had younger children or just thought about the idea of like having a very young child in front of a tablet or a computer for many hours a day might be starting to think about what these potential concerns would be, right? So for some of them, the concern about remote instruction might have been greater than the concern about health risks, which then drove their decision about where to enroll or whether to enroll their child in remote-only instruction in fall 2020. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Tom to try and talk a little bit about, well, where did those students go? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So, at the end of this project, kept following the data into the last completed school year, fall 2021, and saw again, the kids didn't come back. Like we might have expected, particularly for that kindergarten disenrollment, that those kids would either redshirt en masse and show up in kindergarten the next year, or in states where they could just skip ahead to first grade. But first grade enrollment actually fell pretty substantially for a second year in a row. And there was a modest bounce back to pre-pandemic levels of kindergarten enrollment, but not quite getting there. So nothing like a big rush of kids into redshirting. So began to feel as if I was confronting something of an enigma, because not only did we not see the kids coming back to public schools, when we look to other data, for example, Catholic schools are the main private schools, and there's a National Catholic School Association that reports out their data. They were also reporting enrollment declines between fall 2019 and fall 2021. And so another possible source was an increase in homeschooling. And there was an experimental early survey by the Census Bureau that did document a pretty sharp run up in homeschooling in that first year, the fall of 2020. But we knew nothing about whether it sustained to a period when kids were back for in-person instruction. And so this enigma motivated my most recent collaboration with the Associated Press and again with Stanford colleagues at Big Local News. And to try to get at this issue, we wanted to marry what we were seeing in public school enrollment decline with other sources that could tell us where these kids went. But when we look to the federal government, if you looked even today, 3 years into the pandemic, they are not reporting private school enrollment or homeschool enrollment numbers past fall of 2019 from a pre-pandemic period. So to get at this question, we decided, rather than curse the darkness, we'll light a candle. We went after the data ourselves, years ahead of federal reporting, gathering data year by year, state by state, wherever we could, through FOIA requests, scraping websites, et cetera, to document K through 12 enrollment in private schools, homeschools, along with data on the school age population from the most recent census data numbers, which I crunched. And what did we see when we looked at this? Well, first of all, I should stress, we weren't able to get data for every state. We could get private school data for around 3/4 of the country and homeschool data for a little bit over half the country, 21 states and DC, covering over half the school age population. I'll talk about some of the possible biases of that. But first of all, the most striking thing we saw was the role of demographic change. Decline simply in the size of the school age population explained about 26% of enrollment loss. There's been a long-term secular decline in the number of school children in the US. But there was also substantial domestic migration during the pandemic as people responded to the enduring growth of work from home arrangements and housing costs, right? To find a place to live more comfortably during the pandemic. And that demographic change explains a lot of the local variation in public school enrollment loss. I want to show you a scatter plot from an op-ed I wrote in Education Week last year. The horizontal axis is the percent change in the school age population. The vertical axis is the percent change in public school enrollment, both between fall 2019 and fall 2021. There is a one-to-one pattern here. Places that lost more school age population had tracking declines in their public school enrollment. So for example, New York was a big loser of population, lost about 2% of its school age population, and was one of the biggest states, around 5% in terms of public school enrollment loss. And California is close as well. Meanwhile, states like Texas and Florida had modest gains in their school age population. They still lost public school enrollment. I've got kind of a heat map feature. The green states gained public school enrollment, all the others lost. Texas and Florida lost public school enrollment, but the magnitude of that loss was blunted by the in-migration of people there during the pandemic. So demographic change really explains a lot of this variation, both in total and its character by place. Now, we also saw, though, when we got full private school data, that it did grow during the pandemic. There was a 4% growth in private school enrollment between fall 2019 and fall 2021, particularly in those kindergarten grades. Parents simply didn't want to sit a very young child in front of a screen all day, and they found other accommodations, and some of those were private schools. But the contribution of this to explaining that enrollment loss in public schools is relatively modest, only about 14%. And what was really striking was what we, and perhaps most surprising to me, was what we saw in homeschool enrollment changes. There was a really large and sustained growth in homeschool enrollment. It grew 30% between fall 2019 and fall 2021, a year in which schools were largely back to in-person instruction. That robust homeschool enrollment remained. When you might say, okay, 30% sounds big, but it's a percent change off a low base, and that's true. But if you look at the absolute numbers, it's still stunning. For every one kid newly enrolled in a private school, we saw nearly 2 enrolled in homeschool. And that just really surprised me, because as a parent of 2 kids, I can tell you I appreciated at times being able to send them to school. Well, anyway, homeschool growth is an important driver, explains about 26% of enrollment loss. And the AP put together this nice visual for the article they wrote about this, where the top blue line represents the private school pickup of enrollment loss. The next sort of orangey line picks up the more substantial homeschool enrollment. The purple picks up the role of just declining school-age population. But notice there's a lot left here, unexplained public school enrollment loss. So this was something else that really came out of this project. There appear to be missing kids. By missing kids, we mean unexplained public school enrollment decline that we can't see mirrored in population change or growth in other enrollment sources. And to my mind, there are at least 3 not mutually exclusive explanations for this. Increased truancy, some homeschooling that's occurring, but parents simply aren't telling the state, it's unregistered. And third, skipping kindergarten. So they're there, they're in the population, but they're not showing up in any public school enrollment numbers. Critically, each of these has implications for student well-being and educational policy, and I'm going to argue should be a part of our academic recovery discourse, but to some extent are not. I want to point out, I do see some indirect support for that third hypothesis. If I look by state at where are these missing kids really concentrated, it is unambiguously in states like California that do not require kindergarten. So where parents have the option to simply hold their kid back from what many regard as a really developmentally critical period of growth and opportunity for instruction. So to understand why this matters, I just want to say a little bit about the pattern of academic recovery in the US. A lot of it is keyed to the federal support that comes under the ESSER program, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act, that allocated $190 billion with a B to public schools. To give you a sense of the magnitude of that, that's 2 to 3 times the usual annual appropriations for the US Department of Education that they had just for this. But school districts have had these money, states and school districts have had this money for a while, and they've been a little slow to spend it. And they're obligated by law, they've had one extension, they're obligated to spend it by, or at least committed to be spent by 2024. And then we're going to confront a fiscal cliff. And there's a lot of concern that districts with declining enrollment, as one researcher put it, are propping up their budgets with this federal aid and retaining staff rather than facing hard fiscal decisions about a new reality with declining enrollment and kids really being unlikely to come back. So within this context, they're trying also to address learning loss. And there was a recent survey of school business officials that talked about what were some of the most popular targets for that money. Where were they spending the most money? And in particular, privileged things like expanded learning time through the summer, through tutoring, specialist students, support staff. And we're seeing emerging evidence, some of it done right here at Stanford, on how these interventions are working. And frankly, it's a kind of mixed picture because we're confronting that classic last mile problem. when we go to introduce a new intervention, how can we ensure it's being done with really high quality implementation fidelity? But it was also interesting to look at the survey and see what was least popular in terms of district spending on academic recovery, early childhood programs, and community outreach to assess family needs were in the single-digit percentages. Okay, so I think that context is important for thinking about where we are with academic recovery. And I've argued in a recent op-ed that our recovery discourse and activity is biased by a type of streetlight effect. So I suspect many of you know this classic old joke about someone going home at night. In the story I heard, they had enjoyed a few too many fermented beverages, lost their keys, and they're looking for them under the light. And someone comes along to help and says, "Where did you lose your keys?" And they say, "Well, over there in the park." "Well, why are you looking here?" "Well, because the light's brighter." And so this is often brought up as an example of a kind of cognitive bias that can attach to the way we do research and the way we think about challenges. Our gaze is drawn to where the data are bright and illuminating a problem. But the enrollment data are telling us something quite different. The enrollment data are telling us the biggest disruptions to learning environments are the kindergarten level, and I didn't even mention the pre-K level. There's evidence from state-run pre-K program enrollment that a decade of progress in growing those programs evaporated during the pandemic. Okay, but those younger learners, again, who've experienced some of the biggest learning disruptions aren't, in my mind, a sufficient part of the discourse. And also, there are other people who are sort of missing in the data, missing from our consciousness as we think about academic recovery, the truant, the chronically absent. And I sure would like to know what's going on with all these newly homeschooled children, right? Because I think we know very little, and it's hard to get information on that. So I just really I underscored in this op-ed, something I'd like to repeat here. I'm not saying we shouldn't do tutoring and expanded learning time. Those are important and matter. But at the same time, I kind of want to yes and that and say, let's not lose sight of the kids we don't readily see in the data that are commonly available to us. And I think we would have a much better and successful academic recovery, because guess what? Those young kids aren't even going to age into our testing window until we hit the fiscal cliff. And school districts don't have as much money. And I'm particularly worried. I just saw today the Biden administration had an opening salvo of budget negotiations with Congress, and they're very much stressing a deficit mind, of reducing expenditures. But many school superintendents report they're expecting a deus ex machina, money to come and support them from other sources, and it just might not be coming. So let me just offer some concluding thoughts, and then I really want to turn to question and answer and hear what you're seeing and what you'd like to discuss further. So I would stress, first of all, we have a need for sustained sense of urgency and resiliency in addressing the harm of the pandemic for our kids and realizing the potential that we know is in them. And we also need to engage with the question of whether we're prepared to support that academic recovery financially as we look forward to this very imminent fiscal cliff. At the same time, we can't solve a problem we don't understand. So if we want to address this problem in a really authentic way, there's a critical need for better data to understand the multifaceted challenges that all kids are facing, not just the ones in high stakes testing windows, not just the ones still sitting in public schools. And at the same time, as we're juggling all of these plates, we also have an obligation to be ready for the next time a crisis like this might hit. And that's about infrastructure investments in schools and knowing our minds around the best guidance about how to support the development of our kids while maintaining sensible public health precautions.